Господин президент, все чаще звучит фраза «новая холодная война» по отношению к России и к Западу. И мы слышим, как регулярно Россия винит в этой напряженности внешние силы, да, вот, то Америку, то Великобританию, то НАТО. Но, находясь у власти 20 лет, вы не считаете, что вы несете хоть долю ответственности за плачевное состояние этих отношений?
Чувствуем ли какую-то ответственность за то, что происходит? Я чувствую ответственность за то, что происходит с Россией, с ее народом. И все буду делать в интересах Российской Федерации. Мы услышали ваше заверение о том, что НАТО не будет развиваться на восток. Но вы не выполнили своих обещаний.
It's pretty clear at this point that we have entered the Second Cold War. Last year, it could have been a shorter, temporary conflict, with the West clamoring back to maintain interdependency with Russia and the rest of the East. But we are far past that point now. Even if America has a change of heart or government in the near future, the East has lost all confidence in their trustworthiness. This extends to some of America's subsidiaries, like Germany, where Angela Merkel admitted that the Minsk peace agreement between Ukraine and the Donbas republics was actually a ruse to buy time to build up Ukraine's military. Even if you are a Ukraine stan, I think most people can see why Russia and her allies can't trust the West after this. China certainly took note of this betrayal, which has made any good faith agreements over contentious issues impossible. Granted, this doesn't eliminate the possibility of agreements with strict, hard, enforceable triggers. It's just that there will be no trust on either side, making any agreement extremely difficult to come to. However, there was perhaps a much larger breach of trust that has even turned off some of America's allies. A certain amount of sanctions in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine is understandable and even expected from the American point of view. But the extent of economic isolation imposed on Russia has been so over the top that many countries are losing confidence in the West as a stable business partner. Russia is now the most sanctioned country in the world, with more sanctions imposed on it than the next 10 countries combined. Beyond this, many Western companies have pulled their services out of the country, and Western governments have frozen most of Russia's assets abroad. Much of these assets belong to wealthy private citizens within Russia, and when I say frozen, these Western governments have promised they will unfreeze them once Russia leaves Ukraine, which of course will never happen. So this is essentially theft of hundreds of billions of dollars in assets from a country's elite. The logic behind this was that by stealing oligarchs' wealth from them, it would make them mad at Putin and they would overthrow him. However, they didn't seem to take into account that this might just make them mad at the people who stole from them and would increase their support for the person fighting against said thieves. They also didn't seem to realize that an oligarch's power derives from their wealth, and when you take that wealth away, their power ceases to exist. This had the very predictable effect of decreasing the influence of the largely pro-Western elite and turning them against the West, as even if they do get their stuff back, there's no guarantee that the West won't just do this again in the future. Thus, they and many other nations' elites have realized that doing business with the West makes you a hostage to their will. Granted, doing business with only one business partner necessarily makes you dependent on them regardless of who it is. This is why many countries are supporting the creation of an alternative, so that the two major coalitions have to compete for their business. This is my main contention here, that a new Cold War between the East and West will lead to greater autonomy for independence, enabling the possibility for true multipolarity. True, both Russia and China have expressed their desire for a multipolar world, but this is just rhetoric to attract countries to join their coalition. They have both talked about the importance of international law and have shown a clear aversion to a variety of ideologies. Regardless of what you think of these ideologies, it's clear that given the opportunity, the East would overreach and impose its will on the world, just as America has done since the end of the last Cold War. This is why I support a balance. Not only will it help nations outside the empires, but it also has the possibility of improving the empires at home, as they are less likely to overextend. But before we go any further, why don't we set the stage for the Second Cold War?
The Chinese President Xi Jinping has said that the Asia-Pacific is no one's backyard and it should not become an arena of big power rivalry. In the written remarks prepared for a business event linked to the summit, Xi said that no attempt to wage a new Cold War will be ever allowed by the people or by our times. He added that unilateralism and protectionism should be rejected by all. He further outlined that any attempt to politicize and weaponize the economic and trade relations should also be rejected. The comments were in apparent reference to the US efforts to blunt what it sees as China's growing coercive economic and military influence in the region.
The first order of business in any conflict is to identify the actors. Here, the West is led by the Anglo-American Empire, consisting of America, the Anglosphere, and their colonies, both formal like Gibraltar and Guam, and informal like Germany and Japan. The European Union is also part of this coalition, though some of their states like Hungary and Serbia try to align more with Russia, but can't because they need funding from the EU. If an alternative becomes available to them, I wouldn't be surprised if the EU starts to fracture. It's not just eastern-leaning states they have to deal with either. Right-wing states like Italy and Poland also have major problems with the EU, though they have shifted their strategy to trying to take over the bloc as opposed to trying to get rid of it. Then there are the Eurosceptics, which have support across the political spectrum, from nationalists to communists to centrists of both the left and right. Beyond the internal divisions, Emmanuel Macron, the de facto leader of Europe at the moment, has expressed his desire to win back sovereignty from the Anglo-American Empire. To do this, he is seeking to create a military wing of the European Union, as well as establish greater economic ties with China. He has just as much, if not more, antipathy towards China as he does America, so this is clearly a play to make Europe an independent, if not an imperium in its own right. However, this is just creating even more divisions within the EU, with the pro- and anti-China groups on both the left and right fighting each other. Ultimately, while the EU is starting this Cold War in the Western coalition, they are very unstable members at this point. There is a possibility of it dissolving or breaking away in the future. On the other side of the conflict, the East is led by a currently still forming Russo-Chinese empire, or perhaps the Sino-Russian Empire, depending on who is more powerful at any given time. But for now, China has the clear upper hand, so we'll continue with the former. As it is still forming, there aren't as many formal members yet. It's basically just Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, as well as their vassal states like most of Central Asia, and parts of the Middle East like Syria and Houthi-controlled Yemen. While the West has a series of formal alliances like NATO and the EU, the Eastern powers are still in the beginning phases of building similar institutions. Yes, Russia does have the Eurasian Economic Union, but it only consists of 5 former Soviet states, with the last admittance being in 2015. The far more important economic bloc is, of course, BRICS, consisting of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. However, you will note that 3 of the 5 partners are independents, one of which, India, is part of the West's Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, which is basically Asian NATO that aims to counter China. This makes it clear that the main function of BRICS is to economically counter the West and potentially lure more countries to join the East. It may eventually become a core institution of the Eastern powers, but right now it just needs to expand its reach to more lesser powers like South Africa to get them dependent on the East. This process is already happening, with 14 additional countries seeking to join the bloc. If accepted, BRICS would likely have to be renamed for one, but more importantly, they would make up over half of the world's population and control around 60% of global gas reserves. Now, this isn't a particularly formal organization, it's more of a loose association of countries that seek mutual prosperity. However, there are several institutions attached to BRICS, like the New Development Bank, which acts as an alternative to the IMF and World Bank. The BRICS nations are also looking at developing an alternative global reserve currency to compete with the dollar. Recently, many of them have moved to the Chinese yuan for trade, while others, like India, are just using their own currency now. But this is just a short-term fix in anticipation for a more neutral reserve currency, as there are numerous reasons why the yuan is unviable in the long term. All in all, the Eastern Bloc is slowly but surely building up the institutions and alliances to compete with the West. However, for the Russo-Chinese Empire to truly form, there is some unfinished business they need to take care of first. It is often said that without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire, but with Ukraine, Russia cannot be ignored. However, I would argue that this really just applies to Novo Russia, which consists of Crimea, the 4 territories claimed by Russia thus far, plus Kharkiv, Dnipro, Mykolaiv, Odessa, and the much less important Kirovograd. This is because the main importance of Ukraine is their coastal ports, their manufacturing sector, their vast fertile farmlands, and their natural resources, the overwhelming majority of which, plus the 2 largest nuclear facilities in the country, are within Novo Russia. On the cultural side, these territories have always been part of Russia. It was only when the Soviets took over that it was ceded to Ukraine. After the collapse of the Tsarist Empire, the small Ukrainian state invaded Russia practically unopposed and occupied large swaths of the territory. Officially ceding this land was partially due to Lenin not wanting to fight another war, as he was already dealing with several other secession movements at the time. But he likely didn't need much persuading, as the Soviets were very anti-Russian, seeing them as evil colonizers who exploited other peoples. So naturally, they decided to do the same thing to them. This is a map of resource distribution in the USSR. The red is low resource allocation and the blue is high resource allocation. So the Soviet Union should really not be mistaken for Russia, as they were arguably the greatest victim of it. Ukraine, the Baltic states, the Caucasus, and Central Asia were actually its biggest beneficiaries, despite their rhetoric. Given this history, it would be difficult for Russia to claim empire status with parts of its core territory still outside of its control. So despite the slow progress of the war, I expect Russia to continue until they reclaim all of Novo Russia, even if it takes years. However, I do expect things to pick up speed with Ukraine's counteroffensive going on, which isn't going so well for them and is exhausting their troops. This will likely lead to Russia's counteroffensive later on. Ukraine really has no path to victory here. Regardless of the day-to-day of what's happening on the ground, fighting an attrition war against Russia is usually a bad idea. This is not just some historical cliché that has no meaning. If we look at their actual military capabilities, we can see that they have one of the largest stockpiles of military equipment in the world. But this is to be expected. The more important part is that they seem to be capable of continuously replenishing it. Russia has fired many times more missiles than it should have had at the beginning of this war. So either our estimates were off to a cartoonish degree, or they have been replacing them at a rate far beyond what the West is capable of. Evidence seems to point to the latter, as the Russians have repeatedly launched large salvos within 24 to 48 hours, then nothing for several weeks. Of course, there is something to be said about trying to overwhelm defense systems in a concentrated blitz, but this was happening even before Ukraine got anti-air capabilities. Plus, Russia has developed a new tactic of sending out incredibly cheap Shahed suicide drones to draw out and weaken Ukrainian anti-air before launching their missiles. To put this into perspective, this causes Ukraine to destroy $20,000 drones with $1 million ammunition, sometimes more if they miss and have to fire again. This is a resource war, and Russia's plan is to simply drain Ukraine and the West over time. And they can afford it because it's not just drones and missiles that they are outpacing the West on, but artillery as well, which is really the most important part of most land wars. The Russians' massive artillery advantage on the battlefield is why they have done so well in this war, even while being vastly outnumbered in manpower. Now, despite the general perception, Ukraine actually has the second largest land military in Europe, in both manpower and equipment. This makes it difficult for Europe to sustain its military aid, especially since their arms industry is severely lacking. But this is largely due to the fact that they outsource much of their security to the United States, which is why the vast majority of military aid to Ukraine comes from America. However, this is really the first modern high-intensity war we have seen, and it has been difficult for even America's war industry to keep up. Raytheon, for example, is having trouble restocking their anti-air Stinger missiles, and won't be able to complete new Patriot air defense systems until 2032. Why does it take so long, you may ask? Well, it's because America's arms industry is incredibly inefficient. Here's an example. Black powder is required for most parts of the military, for gun ammunition, mortar and artillery rounds, missiles, and much, much more. So you would think this would be something well protected and diversified. It turns out all of America's black powder is produced by a single factory, not a single company, a single factory in Louisiana in the middle of nowhere. And it recently exploded in June of last year. I don't think I need to explain why this is a problem. Now, in all fairness to the in the middle of nowhere part, black powder factories are extremely dangerous, as a single spark, even by static, can lead to disaster. And it needs to be in Louisiana because the humidity reduces the risk of fire and explosions. But they should at least have a few other locations in similar conditions for security measures. The problem is they can't do that because black powder is extremely cheap, as nothing really requires that much of it, and thus it doesn't run a profit. It's kept afloat by subsidies, but this just highlights a major issue with the arms industry as a whole. Everything is so intertwined and bureaucratic that if one thing goes wrong, many other things stop working. The best way I can describe it is that the industry is a tall, thin pyramid, as opposed to a wide one with a solid foundation. This is largely due to the significant consolidation after the end of the First Cold War. America couldn't support 15 different arms makers, so they reorganized down to just 5: Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman. This thinner pyramid necessarily elongates the system and thus increases bureaucracy. Russia, on the other hand, seems to have a healthy arms industry, but with a deeply corrupt military. Employing incompetent generals led to both the Kharkiv withdrawal and many tactical failures in the first few days and weeks of the war. Both Russia and America are trying to make the necessary reforms in real time to gain the advantage. However, America's problem is long-term and can't be solved for many years, whereas Russia can mitigate their problems in the short term by relying on external military groups like the Donbas militias, the Chechens, and potentially still Wagner, depending on the outcome of the treason drama, while promoting those in the military who have proven their capabilities throughout the war. Given all of this and other factors I won't get into here, I do expect Russia to win this war. When will that be? It could be anywhere from several months to a few years from now, depending on the circumstances. That's a much longer conversation, but for now, let's discuss the likely outcomes and their consequences. The ideal scenario for Russia is not actually full annexation, but rather a partition of Ukraine. The Novorussia territories, including Kirovograd, plus Poltava, Sumy, and Chernihiv would be integrated into Russia. Their hope is that Poland, Hungary, and Romania would accept their historical territories in Ukraine as well in order to legitimize their own annexations. It could also help mend their straining relations with those countries. This would result in Poland taking the regions of Lviv, Volyn, Ivano-Frankivsk, Ternopil, and the western half of Rivne. Hungary would retake Zakarpattia, and Romania would retake Chernivtsi. This would leave a small Ukrainian rump state of 5 regions with its capital right next to the Russian border. This is another reason Russia would like Lviv to be taken by Poland, so that any resistance movements in the country can't use a far western city as a base to create more conflict. Given its disproportionate size, any resistance group would have to operate in Kiev, which would be difficult to do with Russia just a few miles away. And they won't have the problem of large swamps, multiple rivers, and radioactive Chernobyls to go through in this scenario. They wouldn't even have problems of military traffic jams, given that there would be anywhere from 6 to 9 roads to the city. Beyond the military threat hanging over Kiev, a capital being so close to the border does present great espionage and influence opportunities. This, plus the fact that they would be landlocked with a very small economy, it's quite clear that Ukraine would ultimately become a vassal state of Russia. Why not just annex it, you might ask? Well, they don't want to deal with pro-Ukrainian rebels in their core territory. Let them play in their little sandbox of independent Ukraine while the country slowly becomes more pro-Russian over time through reconciliation programs and political and economic influence. If you don't think this is likely to work, I will remind you that America did nuke Japan twice. And now they love us. I think we might have taken the wrong lessons from that, mind you, but whatever. The only problem I see with this proposal is that, although it would be incredibly stupid for Poland not to take this deal and gain a significant amount of territory that is historically theirs, you do have to take into account that these aren't actually independent countries. America, Britain, and the EU would be apoplectic with these countries should they even suggest the thought of potentially expanding their territory, so they might not allow the deal to go through. In this case, Russia may just annex the whole country and deal with the rebels until they die out over time. They would likely still have internal borders denoting the boundaries between Novorussia and the Ukrainian oblasts. This would solidify their hold on Novorussia, and should an independence movement succeed in Ukraine, they would only get control over a slightly bigger rump state than the one mentioned above. As for the geopolitical implications, this would clean up the biggest problem at home for Russia, dramatically increase their influence in Europe given that they will now be bordering core European states like Poland and Romania, and it will significantly boost their economic power with all of that fertile farmland and natural resources at their disposal. There will certainly be a lot of cleanup to do, from construction to rebels to reconciliation and so forth. This means it will take time for Russia to be able to take full advantage of the spoils of this war. However, in the long term, this will effectively turn Russia into an empire again, meaning if China doesn't succeed in taking Taiwan, they risk becoming the junior partner in the Eastern Coalition. Speaking of which, why don't we shift our focus a little more eastward to the Asia Pacific, where the next major war is likely to kick off.
The United States plays a major strategic role in the Indo-Pacific. With 375,000 personnel, there's a vast network of operations that extend from Hawaii all the way to India.
Why is Taiwan so important? Well, if you're a resource reductionist who thinks every war is just about control over resources, then you would simply say the word superconductors and then leave the room without any further explanation. The problem with this is that both America and mainland China are developing their own superconductor production at the moment. Granted, they likely won't be able to replace TSMC for many years, so this will still be a factor in the short term. However, if this was really the only issue, China could just wait 10 years for both countries to be self-sufficient on chip manufacturing and integrate Taiwan peacefully, as America would have no stake in the island anymore. But this is not the case. Both China and America are gearing up for war, because they understand that this is not just a short-term issue. Taiwan is seen by much of the foreign policy establishment as a potential American Cuba, a staging ground for operations in China, and a containment seal to prevent Chinese influence in the Pacific. This would give the West total control over everything in the Pacific Ocean, as China would have zero breathing room off of their shores. You can say international waters all you want, but if you control outposts on either side of a waterway, that means you control the waterway. There's also the fact that if there just so happened to be a rebellion in China that we totally had nothing to do with, America can easily supply the moderate rebels with weapons and equipment through Taiwan. This would essentially give the rebels a safe haven around the Matsu Islands and Kinmen County, two different island chains right off the Chinese mainland. Yes, for all of the people who unironically use the term West Taiwan, the country's name isn't even Taiwan, it's the Republic of China, also known as the Rock. Taiwan is merely the main island, but the Republic of China also controls the Penghu Archipelago, the Kinmen County Islands, the Matsu Islands, and several islands in the South China Sea. They also claim control over the Japanese Senkaku Islands, but they are administered by Japan, and they are internationally recognized as part of Japan. Regardless, even if you were able to reach a deal ceding both Kinmen County and the Matsu Islands to China, Taiwan would still be a threat, as it is historically the best staging ground for invasions of China. Given all of this, China cannot viably be considered an empire so long as they remain contained through Taiwan. So what is the likelihood of reunification? Well, it's fairly unlikely to occur peacefully, as the one vaguely pro-China party in Taiwan, the KMT, has recently got in bed with America. Now you might say establishing contacts and sending representatives doesn't necessarily mean they're anti-China, but doing so means they can't take an explicitly anti-Western stance either, which reunification would be seen as. And with it off the table, the KMT's usefulness to Beijing ceases to exist. Their new role is essentially to play good cop to the separatist DPP's bad cop in dealing with China. America is hoping for a similar situation to what happened in Ukraine, pretending to be conciliatory to stave off an invasion, while behind the scenes arming them to the teeth for the inevitable conflict. However, since Angela Merkel openly admitted to this buying time strategy, China might not fall for it as easily as Russia did, since they have already witnessed the West's betrayal. This leaves us with war, but when, and how successful would China be in this scenario? First, we should understand that a cross-straits war would be dramatically different from the one in Ukraine. For starters, a Chinese invasion would largely rely on naval and aerial warfare, whereas Ukraine is almost entirely a land war. The reasons for this are: 1. Anti-air technology is so numerous on both sides that neither side can safely carry out aerial missions consistently. 2. Ukrainian effectively has no navy. And 3. Naval invasions are incredibly costly in modern warfare, so it's usually to be avoided if you can. China obviously does not have this option, and they must carry out aerial missions to reduce Taiwan's defenses. Now you might ask why they can't just lob missiles at them instead. They certainly will do that as well, but Taiwan's main defense will be its air force, and the best way to counter them while they're in the air is with air-to-air missiles. It will be long-range, so you can't really call them dogfights, but the air forces on both sides will see the most action, at least initially. Of course, aircrafts have to land at some point, and China's hypersonic missiles will be targeting their air bases and runways. Now, Taiwan seems to think that using highways as temporary runways is totally a suitable fallback option, but you do need to put the aircraft somewhere before they relaunch, and let's just say that altering a major public transit route into a military base is not the least conspicuous thing in the world. It will get hit just like the others. So given time, Taiwan's air force will cease to exist. The only problem is that China might not have much time before America and possibly Japan arrives. So they much rather defeat Taiwan in the air as well. It might be bloody, but they're on a time limit to entrench themselves on the island. When it comes to the invasion on land itself, China has several options. First, Kinmen County and the Matsu Islands will immediately be occupied without a fight, as there are very few defenses there and it's right up against the mainland. The first real target of the war when it comes to territory will be the Penghu Archipelago. However, I don't expect there to be an actual naval invasion here. China will likely just attempt to encircle it, cut it off from Taiwan, and bomb them until they surrender. Chinese forces may land on the island, but Taiwan isn't going to dedicate many land forces to an area they know they can't supply, and will likely be destroyed quickly on their own. So the Penghu Islands will fall to the Chinese early on in the war. They will then use the archipelago as a staging ground for many of the landing attempts on Taiwan itself. The Penghu operation will be done in concert with degrading the main island's defenses, so they may launch the landing soon after. This is where things get a little more speculative. The way I see it, the three biggest initial targets will likely be the city of Keelung, Yilan County, and Kaohsiung City. Historically, Keelung was the outpost for Western colonies like the Spanish, Dutch, and later the French. This means it was positioned in a very strategic location, as it has direct access to both sides of the island without having to deal with the massive mountains in the middle. It's also home to one of 4 naval bases on the island and has a clear shot at Taipei, the capital. Obviously, you don't want to land directly on the city itself with its rocky beaches and major defenses, but there is a beach not too far north in Jinshan that is one of 2 ideal landing spots for naval invasions on the island. Taking this district would also enable the Chinese to homogenize control over the northern tip of Taiwan, which, in concert with Keelung and Yilan, would create a semi-encirclement of Taipei. Now, Yilan will be a little easier to take over, as the land is very flat for most of the area, and the beaches are very landable. Functionally, they won't be able to move through the mountains very well, if at all, but the shaping of the front line here helps put pressure on Taipei from multiple directions. The Yilan forces will likely move both north and south along the coast to link up with the forces in Keelung, and to march on Huilan County. You might wonder why they would even bother with the eastern shore considering how small and isolated many of their cities are. But we should remember that there might be sea battles with the Americans on this side of the island, and China would very much not want to be sandwiched between Taiwan's forces and them. Taking the northeastern shore, which is right across the way from Japan's Yonaguni Island, makes sure that their backs are up against a mountain when fighting America. The last major target, Kaohsiung City, will probably be the most difficult of the 3 initial objectives. They are unlikely to take the city in the outset. The goal is more about applying pressure and draining Taiwan's resources. The best landing spot in the south is around Jialuteng and Fengshen. These are small towns which likely won't be well defended, as priority should be put on landable beaches in large cities. This allows the Chinese to fight a land war in Pingtung County on the approach to Kaohsiung, and to homogenize the southern tip of the island by marching south. The eventual goal of the southern campaign would be to reach further north to capture Taitung, which, in concert with the Yilan forces marching on Huilan, would solidify China's control over the entire eastern side of the island. There would still be a bunch of small villages to go through, but they're unlikely to be that much of a problem being pressed at both ends. At this point in the war, all China has to do now is put pressure on Taipei and Kaohsiung to drain them of resources, keep America busy off the eastern shores, and either wait for Taiwan's surrender or collapse, or, if that's taking too long, launch new beach landings in Tainan and Taoyuan City to attack their weakened forces from behind, which would likely lead to a collapse. This is the best way for China to win the war while also minimizing damage and casualties. However, military experts seem to think China will just invade Tainan and Taoyuan immediately to try to capture Taipei and Kaohsiung quickly in order to end the war as fast as possible. This would lead to massive losses and be incredibly risky, as these are the most fortified coasts. In my view, this Western strategy, as opposed to my Eastern strategy, fails to understand that this is more of a war against America than Taiwan. Whether the capital is captured quickly or not, this will be a long war. China should recognize this and prepare for a war of attrition. If you ignore the eastern side of the island, China will be pincered between Taiwan and the American Navy. This could lead to them having to retreat from the eastern side, leaving it exposed for America to send send arms and troops to the front line through Yilan and Taitung. Needless to say, this would be an absolute catastrophe for China and would likely cost them the war. But by not having the enemy at your back and potentially being able to use Taiwan's eastern defenses against the Americans, China stands a far better shot at fending off America long enough to win the war. Speaking of battles with America, why don't we look at naval combat next? You might have noticed I haven't mentioned the Navy much yet, and that's because it actually isn't as relevant as you think. This might seem odd given that it is a naval invasion, but when it comes to actual sea combat, all surface vessels are really just food for submarines. China recognizes this, which is why they have been investing a lot of money into submarine research, and have already yielded some major results. The significance of the Navy will be in their battles with America and Japan if they get involved, not Taiwan. This is because America's naval power is vastly superior to that of the Chinese. Though China is set to match America's capabilities in 7 to 10 years, the conflict will probably happen before that time. However, China does have some major advantages that could balance things out in this regard. First, and this shouldn't be underestimated, China gets the first move. This essentially means that the starting point of this war will be China already surrounding Taiwan under the guise of military drills. It will also give them the opportunity to strike at Taiwan's air bases while their aircrafts are still on the ground and vulnerable. American warships and, far more importantly, aircraft carriers will likely be a few days away from the conflict zone, giving China some time on its own. However, due to America's naval superiority, China isn't going to want to just wait for them to arrive. This means you can expect the opening hours of the war to involve China lobbing hypersonics at American vessels, specifically concentrating on the aircraft carriers. And even if the air defenses catch the first volley, which is difficult with hypersonics, there's still many hours of missile attacks ahead of them. To put this into perspective, the highest number of aircraft carriers any country has, aside from America, is 2. The United States has 11 and is currently building 4 more. They are essentially movable bases that America uses to police the world. Normally, a country would not want to put these types of vessels at risk, but it is the only way America can fight China effectively. Without a defensive air force, Taiwan won't last very long, but America can only viably dedicate 3 to 4 aircraft carriers to this conflict, else they risk, well, for one, logistical overload, but also dramatically reducing their military influence in other parts of the world. This means China only really needs to sink a few ships to devastate America's capability in the region, and a surprise attack with hypersonics might just be enough to achieve that. The second major advantage China has is that they are right next to the conflict zone, so they can dedicate a lot more resources to the conflict and get them there sooner, whereas America is constrained to what they already stationed out there in Guam, Japan, and the Philippines. Which, to that point, even if Japan and the Philippines don't get involved directly, if America is launching attacks and restocking supplies from these countries' soil, they are ultimately responsible for America's actions in the conflict. And given that China may want to strike the ports that house American naval vessels, this could draw both countries deeper into the war. In fact, America is actually counting on that for Japan because they still have a pacifist constitution, meaning they can't use their own military unless directly attacked. The Philippines can't do much themselves, as their third world military is next to worthless against an actual modern, developed military like China's. But they have said that their involvement in the conflict is inevitable, so they might just throw away lives here and there to make their Western bosses happy. Needless to say, if China attacks American vessels in these countries, the Western media won't specify what they targeted. They'll just state that they attacked Japan and the Philippines, implying that China plans to conquer them as well during the war. They will try to use this to justify starting World War III because the media are insane, dangerous fanatics. But hopefully people are more sensible than that, and this will just drum up more support for the existing war instead. Looking at possible resolutions to this war, I see 4 likely outcomes depending on China's strategy. Of course, if America decides to start World War III, all of this goes out the window and we are looking at an entirely different scenario. But luckily, I don't think they're insane enough to do that, so let's stick with the current situation. If China goes with my Eastern strategy, I believe they will eventually attain a decisive victory. It will be drawn out, but all scenarios for this war will be. This would result in all of Taiwan and its smaller islands being ceded to China, with America humiliated and Japan agitated. With America's defeat in East Asia, Japan would likely seek to become a military powerhouse on its own, regardless of what its neighbors think about it. They may even develop nukes, which they can likely do within 6 months with their current technology, to assuredly deter China. America might not like this, but it would be in their interest to have an allied major military power with nukes in the region to prevent further Chinese expansion. The second scenario is the opposite. If China goes with the experts' Western strategy, there are 3 likely outcomes. First, a decisive bloody defeat of China. As stated earlier, it would be difficult for them to hold the eastern waters of the island if they are sandwiched between Taiwan's forces and the Americans. When they pull back from the eastern side in this scenario, they will still have to fight the Americans at sea on their flanks. Otherwise, they will be cut off from the island entirely and thus lose the war. If America is successful in this pincer maneuver, there would likely be a negotiated surrender of the Chinese troops stuck on the island, and peace talks would begin to end hostilities. Some of the smaller islands that are close to China's shores may need to be ceded to them to allow the Chinese to save face and end the conflict. However, if America wants total victory, it could blow up in their face because they would need to practically invade the Chinese mainland in order to secure Kinmen County and the Matsu Islands. Considering China's massive defenses around them, along with the advantage of fighting defensively on home turf, this could turn into a Stalingrad moment for America. This is the third possible outcome, where America overreaches, gets their forces in the region destroyed, and China counterattacks to eventually secure Taiwan, with America now out of the picture. This would be the most bloody and disastrous outcome for everyone involved, as even China would be crippled by such a pirate victory. The last possible outcome would occur if China goes with the Western strategy and is able to hold their flanks. This means that they would be able to continue supplying their troops on Taiwan, but America would as well through their beachhead on the eastern side of the island. Given long-range weaponry, supplying a beachhead in such a scenario would be fragile and costly for both sides, but there would be little choice for the two given the stakes. While this would lead to high casualties on both sides, China has the advantage on land with their superior manpower, artillery, and armor, along with their significantly shorter supply route. Because of this, it is likely they would eventually dominate the western side of the island, but with America entrenched on the eastern side, along with the giant mountain range in their way, I can see this turning into a frozen conflict with neither side capable of crossing the mountains. At this point in the war, once it becomes clear there is a stalemate, it is possible a cessation of hostilities occurs, effectively dividing the island between West Taiwan and East Taiwan, much like the division between East and West Germany during the First Cold War. There may be a formal agreement on the border, or simply an informal understanding of where things lie. This outcome would have the same effect on Japan as a straight Chinese victory would. I think it would be beneficial for America to play into this by ceding control of East Taiwan to Japan. Therefore, invading East Taiwan would mean invading a nuclear-armed military power who is also your next-door neighbor. Plus, Japan has an old claim to the territory, as they are the ones who modernized the island. America can bloviate about sovereignty all they want, but at the end of the day, East Taiwan will be a colony of someone. Better it be a built-up Japan that can effectively contain China than America, who's halfway across the planet and can't include East Taiwan under their nuclear umbrella. And for those who ask why they can't be included, I'm referring to the idea of mutually assured destruction. If China nukes East Taiwan, our response won't be to nuke them back, as nuking East Taiwan is not an existential threat to us. Instead, we would aggressively restart the war, likely with a coalition at that point to punish the use of nukes. But if they nuke a nuclear-armed Japan, that would be an existential threat to them, and they would nuke them back. especially because Japan isn't as powerful as America. In reality, China would not nuke or even invade a nuclear-armed Japan because they understand the risk to them and all of humanity. Thus, giving East Taiwan to Japan would permanently end the possibility of the conflict restarting. And this wouldn't be an existential problem for China because they will now have a nearly impenetrable buffer between the West and their shores. I actually think this would be the most beneficial outcome, as China gets their buffer zone and most of the useful territory on Taiwan, while America contains China through a more powerful partner in Japan and their land border with the Chinese. I know America would rather Japan remain a colony of theirs than a partner in their coalition, but that is simply unrealistic and small-minded in the context of the Second Cold War. As I often say, if you go for all or nothing, you're going to end up with nothing. The final question as to when China will launch the invasion really depends on how quickly and thoroughly they can clean things up at home. They don't want to start a major operation like this and have other issues erupting at home that could destabilize, or in the worst case scenario, overthrow their regime. Of course, America has home problems of its own, as does Russia and Europe. So why don't we look at internal issues next that could be consequential in the geopolitical landscape to come?
Is one of multiple locations that have been burning in Kenosha, Wisconsin over the course of the night. And what you are seeing now, these images came and come in stark contrast to what we saw over the course of the daytime hours in Kenosha and into the early evening, which were largely peaceful demonstrations in the face of law enforcement. It wasn't until night fell that things began to get a little bit more contentious. Things were thrown back and forth. Police started using some of those crowd dispersal tactics like tear gas, even playing very loud sounds to push them out.
First, let's start with the most obvious and important issues, the ones relating to society and culture. It's pretty clear that the West is in social disarray. Much of this can be attributed to what is colloquially referred to as wokeism. I'm not a fan of the term, but that's a subject for another day. This ideology has created numerous issues, mainly revolving around ethnic and gender conflict. Most Western governments and many companies are actively pushing these ideas, leading to further social degradation. However, it would be foolish to believe that you can punch so hard in a direction like this and not expect an equal and opposite response. This is where Russia sees an opportunity to support the growing right-wing opposition and backlash. For one, whether the end result of the backlash is beneficial or not, it does destabilize Western societies and governments. Of course, a stable decline is far worse than an unstable progress, but these disruptions will make it difficult for the current regimes to counter Russia effectively. On top of that, if Russian-backed opposition groups eventually gain power in their countries, this will dramatically improve Russia's strategic positioning in Europe, especially if it's a core state like Germany, France, Italy, or Spain. Oddly enough, China is actually pushing in the opposite direction. They are supporting these socially subversive ideas and groups in the West while suppressing the same within their own country. This is likely due to China's ethnocentrism and grievance against the West for the century of humiliation. This is when China was incapable of fending off colonial powers and had to yield to many of their demands. And while getting back at the West likely isn't consciously on their mind, I wouldn't be surprised if this was a major subconscious influence on their thinking. To that point, left-wing movements in the West tend to be more receptive to China, especially on economic issues. Getting them in power and working with them would help their goals of economic colonization. This would satiate their getting back at the white man complex, while also firmly solidifying Russia's role as the junior partner in their coalition. The opposite could happen if Russia establishes its dominance over Europe through its favored parties. So you have this inter-coalition power struggle going on in the East, limiting their strategic coherence. However, since they have both ends of the political opposition covered, they've kind of accidentally created a much larger potential bloc to overrule the establishment. On the other hand, the establishment can easily bank on the hard left and the hard right refusing to work with each other at all, seeing their opposite as more of a threat than the status quo. Granted, the last time they worked together kind of ended in complete catastrophe for both of them, so the concerns aren't entirely unfounded. However, I personally do not see anyone becoming the next Stalin or Hitler anytime soon. Most of the dissidents on both sides condemn them anyways. Nonetheless, a cross-political dissident coalition is very unlikely due to so much distrust. Some will try, but I really don't see it going anywhere. While on the surface, much of the East may seem well put together socially, there are issues beneath the surface that may be just as concerning. The biggest problem they face is an impending demographic collapse, with different effects for different countries. Russia's 143 million population is expected to decrease to about 112 million by the end of the century. This could lead to major social conflict if the government decides to import immigrants to offset the loss of labor. However, this issue could simply be avoided if they push for increased automation, reducing the need for labor to begin with. This, of course, comes with its own social implications, but class conflict is a lot easier to mitigate with bread and circus than ethnic conflict due to loss of identity. Though it remains to be seen whether Russia has the will and ability to make this transition towards automation to a necessary degree. China, on the other hand, is in no danger of underpopulation. Their problem is that they will have a large elderly population with a dramatically smaller young population to support them. Xi Jinping has recognized this and has done a complete 180 on their one-child policy. There are not only no restrictions now, but the government is actively seeking ways to encourage people to have more kids. A good example of this is the government's introduction of a cooling-off period for couples seeking divorce, where they have to wait 30 days after applying to confirm it. This curtailing of impulsive divorce decisions has led to a 70% decrease in divorces in the country. Of course, marriage doesn't necessarily mean having kids, but this is a step in the right direction nonetheless. As bad as China's demographic problem is, it could seem small in comparison to their other major social issue, the growing nihilism in their populace. I'm not talking about what the CPC calls historical nihilism, which just refers to views about history they disagree with. I'm referring to people actually just giving up on life. One of the biggest factors in this is the fact that many young people work their whole life to get a high-end degree from a university, only to realize they can't get a job in that field. This is because there are significantly more people with those degrees than high-skilled jobs available for it, meaning only the best of the best can get hired, and for those who do, they get overworked because employers can always find someone desperate enough to deal with the long hours. This means many highly educated people are having their skills wasted on low-skilled subsistence jobs, or worse, choosing to lie flat, as it's called in China, and not work at all. This is the result of two major factors. First, China's failure to scale up their economy to create more demand for high-skilled workers. There's plenty of potential growth in this regard, considering that most of the interior of the country lives in third-world conditions. The second factor, which may relate to this, is the chronic lack of ambition due to government indoctrination, emphasizing the collective over the individual. This leads people to just want to be part of something bigger rather than being a great man of history themselves. They also don't want to accidentally reach beyond the bounds of what the government finds acceptable. Because once you become successful in China, you are now part of the game of politics, which could be very dangerous if you don't know how to handle that aspect. Simply put, China needs to change the culture in the country in order to drive innovation, which in turn will grow and upscale the economy, providing more jobs for those with high skills, and thus encouraging ambition and hope for the future, as their efforts will now be rewarded. It's clear that this is a bit of a cycle, so they likely want to address both the culture and economics at the same time to avoid an imbalance. Whether not enough innovation to expand the economy, or not enough workers to fuel such growth. You need to have both the engine and fuel to make the car move, and to justify each other's existence. I haven't seen any indication that China knows how to solve this problem yet, as they are just cracking down on the associated lying flat movement. But it is a fairly new and complex issue, so things may change in the future. Now, economically, both the East and West have the challenge of decoupling from the other without totally wrecking their economy. The problem with this is that the East has mostly resource and manufacturing economies, while the West has service and consumption economies, meaning the West consumes resources but doesn't produce enough of them, and the East produces resources but doesn't consume enough of them. So who would you rather be in this scenario? If you have engines with not enough fuel, the cars won't move. Whereas if you have fuel but not enough engines, only some cars will move. Essentially, this has the effect of slowing down the economies of the East while completely crashing the economies of the West. Alternatively, you can argue that instead of distributing the fuel equally, the West concentrates the little fuel they have in their favored cars. This means they catch up to the East, but smaller businesses struggle or die while large multinationals prosper with lower competition. This would obviously reduce innovation and increase corruption. So it looks like either way you put it, the East has the advantage, at least in the short term. Mind you, this lack of supply for the West and lack of demand for the East is largely temporary, as both are capable of producing the other in time. In the long term, it is easier to find more fuel than it is to build more engines. We also have to take into account the independents, who have a healthy mix of both. This means that neither side's transition will be catastrophic unless very poor decisions are made. Speaking of, the problem the West has is that even though they are certainly capable of gaining the resources they need, the current leadership in many of these countries are more focused on climate change. Now, some of these initiatives do actually produce more sustainable products that are less resource intensive, like nuclear energy. Unfortunately, that is an extreme minority of environmental activism. They are more focused on genociding cows, destroying farms, not harvesting oil, coal, or minerals, and pushing electric cars that are actually far worse for the environment and consume more resources. If these people gain or remain in power, it is very likely the East will surpass the West. However, there is some backlash against these groups and their policies, which should concern the East because without the environmentalists holding the West back, the East will be the ones playing catch-up. I have already explained China's difficulty in scaling up their economy, and Russia's challenge of increased automation, so I think it's time we talk about international competition between the major powers of the Second Cold War.
1957 was the year of the first Earth satellite, a Russian satellite, a 184-pound metal sphere called Sputnik 1. It radioed back to Earth the first signals from space. 1 month later came Sputnik 2, 1,000 pounds this time. It even carried a dog, the first space traveler. 80 days after Sputnik 1, America launched its first satellite, Explorer 1.
This is a major part of what I call the healthy balance. Economies thrive on competition, so logically humanity will thrive on the competition of entire civilizations. And it won't just be on economics, but culture, ideology, religion, aesthetics, art, and science as well. Of course, with more all-encompassing structures competing, there is both greater potential and greater risk. The higher risk is that nations and empires can do war and nukes, whereas companies theoretically could as well, but it is inordinately unlikely. However, half of this has always been the case, and the other half has been the case since the 1950s, so I don't really see the risk as particularly relevant. The greater potential, on the other hand, is a straight net benefit. You could argue that civilizational competition has always been the norm as well, but this is only true on a passive basis. Individual institutions compete with each other, and that will necessarily mean they compete with institutions of other countries. But nations themselves, the governments, rarely care about anything other than power, profit, and glory. Now, glory is the most similar to what I'm referring to here, but striving for a personal best is very different than continually competing with a rival to surpass them. This concerted effort on all fronts is really only something we see in Cold Wars. And to clarify, there have been many Cold Wars throughout human history, they just weren't named that officially. For example, the alliance of Fascist Italy, National Socialist Germany, and Imperial Japan engaged in civilizational struggle with the East and West well before any war broke out. They didn't just build up their militaries and economies, but their arts, sports, and sciences as well. Their ideology and culture were also pushed in other countries to increase their influence and reach. With this oppositional force, the East and West strove to do the same, lest they fall behind and leave the world to the Axis. You might say this is a terrible example because it ended in a hot war, but this is really only due to the fact that nukes hadn't been invented yet. If they had, with all three sides in possession of them, World War II would never have happened. In a way, humanity's most horrific and destructive invention, the nuke, is also the most beneficial to all of us, as it forces us to deal with each other's differences in a less murderous manner. The First Cold War is perhaps a clearer example. After 1949, when the Soviets got the nuclear bomb themselves, America and Great Britain couldn't just invade them like Germany did. This meant that only proxy wars, shadow wars, spy games essentially, and influence campaigns could be waged. It also meant to stay ahead, each side had to strive to surpass the other in every aspect. This led to things like the space race, moving all of humanity closer to becoming a multi-planet species. Unfortunately, the Soviets collapsed before we could fully realize that potential, and now with international cooperation, we're kind of like, we'll get there eventually. As the Second Cold War gets going, there will be less cooperation and more competition, so hopefully we can get things back on track soon. The fear of Russia, China, or America colonizing Mars will certainly spur quickened action in each of them. This is my point, the idea of civilizational struggle improving humanity as a whole. However, a third option beyond independence, like prior to World War II, would be even more beneficial. One of the pitfalls of a strictly bipolar world is that movements, groups, and independents always have to pick the lesser of two evils when looking for a patron, ally, trade partner, etc. With a third option, however, a new game is in play. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. For now, at least. This gives you two options when you're heavily opposed to one of the three. You are also more likely to be in greater ideological alignment with one of them, considering there are now three paradigms rather than two. A serious problem in the First Cold War was that if you even suggested anything against what was paradigmatically allowed, you would be deemed a traitor, spy, foreign asset, communist sympathizer, or well-meaning but playing into the hands of the enemy. You just could not have a different opinion. With multiple paradigms, on the other hand, you may be tolerated and even given some concessions if the ruling ideology fears the third more than you. Or you can decide to align with the third to overturn the status quo. And if you are the status quo, you can work with both alternatives to fight against the other in order to stay in power. This creates a much more dynamic and competitive world where competition leads to greater progress in all aspects of life. You could argue this runs a higher risk of greater destruction as well. I concede that this is true, but I would argue that it's better to move forward into the dangerous unknown and have a chance to survive than to slowly rot away, sitting in safety, waiting for your eventual demise. I do see this restlessness in one particular region of the world, which may result in a possible third paradigm forming: Europe. Aside from a few Eastern-friendly states like Hungary, Bulgaria, and Serbia, Europe is mostly in the West's back pocket. However, there is significant discontent with the status quo from both the left and the right in Europe. The establishment has always been able to rely on their votes to keep their opposite out of power. Just look at France, where communists and socialists voted in droves for the fervent capitalist Emmanuel Macron, simply to keep Marine Le Pen out of power, who herself is a right-wing socialist. But this blockade of the right from power is starting to crumble. It used to be taboo to even be vaguely right-wing in much of Europe, due to the constant propaganda about the two world wars and the Axis powers, claiming everything is nationalism's fault. It was seen as your patriotic duty to keep the right from power, even if that meant voting for a party you despise, lest a Hitler demon spring forth and start murdering everyone. However, this hyperbolic and frankly ridiculous concern has been lessened by the right gaining some limited power in Europe and not going on Hitlery murder sprees. It's also become more apparent that mass immigration into Europe has been an absolute catastrophe for them, both socially and economically. With a higher supply of labor, the demand for it decreases and thus reduces wages for workers. This is obviously good for businesses, their owners, and investors, which is what they refer to when they say it's good for the economy. But it hurts much of the people within this improved economy. Ultimately, the answer to labor shortages is not more labor, but rather more automation, as there are high-skilled jobs to create those automated machines and software. Socially, it's pretty obvious that despite the many integration programs and efforts, the migrants and their descendants are just not interested in giving up their culture and identity. Many of them see themselves as foreigners who want to make the country more like them so they don't feel as foreign. This is evident in the ethnic enclaves or ghettos, sometimes referred to as no-go zones, where they follow their own rules rather than the state's. Since many of them effectively see themselves as and act as colonizers, more and more natives are seeing them that way as well. This single issue of immigration and the right's good behavior has led to a slow but continuous rise of the right in Europe. However, they are kind of split three ways between the Western-friendly right, like Poland, the Eastern-friendly right, like Hungary, and those who are wary of both. There are also those like Giorgia Meloni of Italy that work for Western interests for tactical reasons. She supports Ukraine, the EU, and the Euro in order to be considered acceptable to the West, allowing her to pursue her right-wing agenda relatively unhindered, though obviously at a slower pace than desired. Ultimately, she's playing the long game here, trying to become the right-wing version of Angela Merkel. A secondary motivation could be to turn Europe into a superpower itself and become more than just an independent, but a third competing empire. Pursuing this ambition would also resolve some of the internal conflicts within the right, as they could be friendly to both the East and West on desired issues, while opposing them on their disputes. And there would be an ideological distinction between the three, as European chauvinism is even on the rise in elements of the left and establishment in Europe. It's just that they are ideologically chauvinist, promoting their human rights everywhere, whereas the right is ethnically chauvinist. This imperial, colonial attitude very much goes against both the traditionalist East and the liberal West. If this is to occur, it will take time for the Third Empire to form. Hell, we're still waiting for the completion of the Second Empire right now. But I do think this is the direction Europe is heading in. The only question is how long it will take and what its eventual form will be. With all of this talk of empires, we shouldn't forget about those players outside of the major coalitions, the ones who try to work both with and against them in a constant struggle to maintain their sovereignty, while also securing internal prosperity. Yes, it's time to talk about the independents.
All is not lost yet. The outcome of this summit is a testament to the power of collaboration and unity. We have reaffirmed our commitment to the people of Niger and to the progress of our entire ECOWAS community. And you will see from the communique of this extraordinary summit that no option is taken off the table, including the use of force as a last resort.
At the very beginning of the Second Cold War, it may seem like a lot of traditionally independent countries like India and various African nations are throwing their lot in with the East. But you should remember that the Second Empire hasn't fully formed yet, and we're still under American hegemony. It is in the interest of an independent for an opposing empire to form, so they don't have to play strictly by one side's rules, as this would increase their sovereignty. But in the long term, once the Second Empire is firmly established, they will have contentions and agreements with both. India is a good example of this. They have a border dispute with both China and Pakistan, yet they are a part of BRICS and have a very good relationship with Russia. The West doesn't like the ruling BJP's Hindu nationalism, but they work with them to contain China by countering their Belt and Roads initiative and their Taiwan ambitions. India clearly wants an alternative to Washington, but they also don't want a powerful empire right on their border. Given all this, it's pretty clear that they would much prefer Russia was leading the Eastern Empire and China was the junior partner. Smaller, less powerful countries, like those in Africa, have to choose a patron, and siding with the East now increases their options and improves their negotiating position, as there would then be an alternative. With that said, a weak, small country has little sovereignty to begin with, as they are reliant on others for resources, legitimacy, and development. This means that the only thing stopping them from being completely dominated by one side is the threat of the other doing the same. This is why Afghanistan remained independent during the colonial era, because the British and Russian empires didn't want to border each other, so they agreed to leave it alone. These types of states aren't much of players themselves, and are more just pawns for the more powerful actors. So why don't we look at these more powerful independents, as they are the ones who are more likely to affect the behavior of the empires. The four most powerful independents right now are India, Brazil, Turkey, and the often overlooked Egypt. I already touched on India, but just adding on a bit, they will likely continue having good relations with America so long as they don't interfere with their domestic affairs, or punish them for their friendly relationship with Russia. Considering how much of a control freak America is, this very simple task may just prove too difficult for them. But should they see reason, America can very easily have a powerful, reliable partner in countering China in the region. This also means that Russia has to walk a fine line in their alliance with China. They obviously have to support each other in most matters, but Russia can't be seen as helping China in ways that directly conflict with India. This mostly just has to do with Kashmir, the McMahon Line, and other border disputes. But considering India's potential involvement in Taiwan's security through the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, Russia may have to leave the Taiwan issue strictly to China. This wouldn't be surprising since China has its own reasons for not getting involved in Ukraine either. Plus, both countries would like to be the leading coalition partner, so the other struggling a little in their respective war isn't the worst thing in the world for them. Moving on to Brazil, they kind of have and want good relations with all of the major powers. Under both Bolsonaro and Lula, Brazil has had growing economic ties with Russia and China, and has been somewhat sympathetic to Russia's actions in Ukraine. Their encouragement of peace negotiations to end the war has led to strained relations with America, though. This is despite them being the only BRICS country to officially condemn Russia's invasion and call for them to withdraw. If America continues with this all-or-nothing mentality, they're going to push otherwise neutral countries further to the east. Because both presidents have sought good relations with America, but their perpetually hostile attitude towards anyone who deviates from their dictates is making it difficult. America should not want China to gain a foothold in Latin America, and pushing the largest and most powerful country in the region into their hands is not helping. One major concern about the current regime in Brazil is that they are very friendly towards communist movements, groups, and governments in the region. They also just banned Bolsonaro, their only real opposition, from elections, so Brazil will likely become a communist country themselves in the near future, or face significant unrest in opposition to their takeover. Since America has been focusing most of its attention on continents halfway across the planet, we haven't really had time to deal with any issues directly south of our border. This lax approach to Latin America has led to communists and cartels flourishing at the country's expense. If America wants to stem the flow of migration into its country, they need to have neighbors that aren't in complete economic disarray with murderous cartels running rampant. Of course, the ruling political party here has no interest in curbing migration. In fact, they want to increase it, so improving the lives of Latin Americans is in direct opposition to their agenda. Perhaps if this demographic turns out to be less of a reliable vote for them, they may change their tune. Slightly, at least. Speaking of migration, Turkey under Erdogan is a bit of a snake that absolutely no one can trust. He has openly called for Turks living in Europe to have 5 children each in order to take over the continent and turn it Muslim. This is despite Turkey being a part of NATO and attempting to become a part of the EU. Obviously, Erdogan's hostile intentions and attitude has brought those efforts to a standstill. Then he decides to send heavy arms to Ukraine to fight Russia, despite trying to be a neutral arbiter for peace talks. Unsurprisingly, this has not worked out. This mentality of trying to have everything both ways defines Turkey's relationship with practically everyone. Erdogan will help you out, then stab you in the back, then put a band-aid on it, then act like nothing ever happened, then punch you in the face, and then offer to shake hands and let him in as a trusted ally. This frantic, opportunistic, and frankly idiotic foreign policy behavior is rooted in Erdogan's belief that Turkey is, or should be, one of the Big Five, as he calls it. The other four are Russia, China, America, and India, but the idea that Turkey is anywhere near the power of even India is utterly delusional. I respect ambition, but Erdogan's pride has betrayed him at every turn. Had he been more friendly and cooperative with Europe, he could have become part of the EU, and by extension the Schengen area. This would have allowed him to flood Europe with non-Europeans unabated until he achieved his goal of colonization. And had he actually been neutral in the Ukraine war, Russia might have considered using them as an arbiter for peace talks, as opposed to someone like China, who has been fairly neutral despite their alliance with Russia. Ultimately, through arrogance and trying to hit too high above his weight, Erdogan has become a tool of others to use where he's useful and discarded where he's not. Russia used them for the grain deal with Ukraine, but not for peace talks. America uses them to bolster NATO, but works against their regime to get a liberal in power. China uses them for the Middle Corridor trade route, but fights against their influence in Central Asia. This may work for Turkey in some ways, but it has reduced their status in the world to being a useful idiot for the major powers, where they get what they want while Turkey is left in the dust. Finally, Egypt isn't generally a country people think of when talking about major independent power brokers, but they are neck and neck with Turkey for the most powerful military in the Middle East. Obviously, this means they're the most powerful in Africa as well. This is particularly relevant given the fact that wars are happening on all of their borders. Literally all of them. Libya and Sudan are in civil war, while Israel and Gaza like to lob rockets at each other from time to time. Egypt's intervention in these conflicts makes them a major power broker in the region. They consistently act as a mediator for peace talks between Israel and Gaza. This isn't because they have good relations with both, but because they have frosty relations with the two. Gaza is a source of terrorism flowing into their country, and there is still some grievances from their various wars with Israel. But by being the principal mediator, Egypt has gained some international credibility, which is needed to stave off potential future attempts by the West to enact regime change in their country. In the Libyan civil war, they have backed the anti-democratic Haftar forces, fighting against the Western and Turkish-backed central government. Though they haven't gone full out in their support, they have limited it to sending them arms and equipment, along with the occasional airstrike here and there, usually against terrorist groups. The conflict has been frozen since a ceasefire in 2020, and the UN is trying to organize elections in the country. But both sides are doing everything they can to shape the election rules, and neither side will likely accept the results. So I don't see this being resolved anytime soon. A Haftar victory in Libya would dramatically expand Egypt's influence in the region and push out the Americans and Turks from the country, denying Turkey any influence in Africa. The Sudan civil war has just started, so Egypt hasn't gotten involved yet. But it's no secret that they back the military government against the democratic RSF rebels. Egypt's President Sisi has publicly declared neutrality, but there are conflicting reports suggesting they may be covertly aiding the Sudanese military. They likely don't want this done publicly since their ally in Libya, Haftar, supports and is arming the RSF. He's likely doing this to strengthen his own position against Egypt so he doesn't just function as a puppet for them in Libya. However, de facto control over Sudan is seen as existential for Egypt, as they need them as an ally to secure their water supply from the Nile. Ethiopia has built the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD, on the Blue Nile, and Egypt is in heated negotiations with them to maintain sufficient water levels. It is right across the border with Sudan, so it was speculated that if worse came to worse, Egypt would invade and seize control of the dam. They obviously wouldn't be able to do that with a pro-Western government in Khartoum. This has led to speculation that if worse came to worse in Sudan, Egypt would launch a full-scale invasion of the country. This would likely result in a decisive Egyptian victory considering the vast military differential, but it could be disastrous diplomatically. Egypt isn't doing very well economically and are relying on foreign investments to bolster economic growth. However, one of the biggest contributing countries is the UAE, who is suspected of being behind the RSF coup attempt. A direct invasion could cut off many of those funds and cause further economic problems at home. But ultimately, I think this plan would be a net benefit for Egypt, as losing their water supply would be far worse. Plus, with the RSF out of the picture, Haftar would have no other viable allies to turn to, so this would consolidate their power in Libya as well. Egypt could also lessen the diplomatic blow by keeping the Sudanese military in power as a puppet and portraying themselves as peacekeepers that promote stability in the region. They may lose UAE funding but gain investments from other countries in the process. The significance of these moves in the broader picture of the Second Cold War is that Egypt has the potential to push both the Americans and Russians out of the region. Getting Haftar in power in Libya and destroying the RSF in Sudan would eliminate the possibility of American bases on their borders, aside from Israel, obviously. And the Sudanese military was planning to allow Russia to build a navy base on their Red Sea coast. Egypt was not happy about this at all, as they want to be the regional power and not take sides with either of the empires. In fact, they have a policy that no foreign military should have a foothold in their country or their neighbors. Again, aside from Israel. If Egypt helps destroy the RSF for the standing government, they will have a lot more leverage to prevent the base from being built. There will still be American peacekeeping troops along their border with Israel to prevent another war between them, and an American Navy biolab in Cairo. But neither of these really threaten Egypt's sovereignty as their presence is so minimal. With both empires out of the picture, the East and West will have to work with Egypt and their allies, partners, or puppets, whatever they turn out to be, to fight against terrorism, migration, and poverty in Northeast Africa. They also control one of the most important naval passageways on the planet with the Suez Canal, making it a major trading hub. Now, due to the Convention of Constantinople in 1888, Egypt can't deny any ship passage through the canal unless they are at war with their country. However, Britain made a bit of a legal stretch with this agreement by closing the canal to the Central Powers during World War I and the Axis powers during World War II. Because of this precedent, it is vital for both empires to remain on Egypt's good side, lest they find a legal loophole to block one or both of them during a hypothetical future conflict. So Egypt does have some leverage now, but it is in the process of gaining even more leverage with their current maneuvers to dramatically bolster their country's prominence on the international stage. With this talk of powerful independence out of the way, I feel we should look at important trade routes and their geopolitical implications before we close things out.
In the Western Hemisphere, 800 miles north of the equator, a narrow land bridge connects two continents and separates two oceans. In 1914, this land bridge, or isthmus, was severed, cut in two by the Panama Canal.
Trade routes are more than just a means of exchanging goods. They are important strategic, economic, and political investments in the countries they pass through. So let's start with the Middle Corridor, a trade route connecting East Asia to Europe through Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Turkey. This is a major part of China's Belt and Roads Initiative, essentially trying to revive the ancient Silk Road, albeit using a slightly different route. There are two other routes that are currently used, the Northern Corridor through Mongolia, Russia, and Belarus, and the Suez route through Singapore, the Malacca Straits, and obviously Egypt's Suez Canal. The middle corridor is very important to China as an alternative for several reasons. First, both routes may not be reliable in the future. The northern corridor could be compromised if things continue to escalate in the Ukraine war, whether it be more stringent sanctions against Russia and Belarus, or even a total closing of Poland's borders with Belarus due to a military buildup. Trade is still flowing for now, but China can't risk that always being the case. The Suez route has a similar problem. During a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, the Americans may try to block passage through the Malacca Straits to reduce China's oil supply. Since the straits are controlled by 3 countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, it is speculated that they won't see this as a violation of their sovereignty, as neither one fully controls it. While this sounds relatively absurd, Singapore's neutrality between China and America means they couldn't engage the American blockade. They would likely just send a strongly worded letter condemning it. Malaysia is practically a puppet state for the West, so they wouldn't object, and Chinese-friendly Indonesia wouldn't want to act unilaterally on territory they don't fully control. So this is a possibility, and China wants an alternative to mitigate the potential damage. One solution to this that isn't being discussed much is the possibility of diverting the Suez route slightly south through the Sunda Straits and the port of Jakarta. The Americans trying to blockade this route would effectively constitute an invasion of Indonesia, which is severely unlikely to occur, so China wouldn't need to worry that much. However, there are 2 major hurdles for this alternative. One, the port at Jakarta is nowhere near as developed as the one in Singapore, and 2, the Java Sea and the Sunda Straits requires highly skilled mariners due to the shallow waters and frequent storms. This means this can become an alternative in the long run with the development of the Jakarta port and higher training of mariners passing through, but it will take time. So at the moment, that leaves us with the middle corridor. Russia, China, and Turkey are all vying for influence in Central Asia. Being former Soviet states, they are largely within Russia's sphere of influence at the moment. But China used to control both Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan under the Qing dynasty, and Central Asia as a whole is the origin of the Turks. The current route goes strictly through Kazakhstan, but China is seeking to expand this influence to the other states with a railway connecting China with Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. This decreases the length of the route to the port in Turkmenistan, enabling quicker shipments to the Caucasus. It also diversifies the trade route possibilities, giving China significant leverage over all of Central Asia. If Kazakhstan is misbehaving, they may use the southern route more. If the other states start having problems, China can threaten to only use the route through Kazakhstan. This makes it vital for all of these countries to keep China happy. The only reason Tajikistan is left out of this is because their typography is terrible for trade, with their massive mountain ranges. But with them landlocked and surrounded by Chinese-friendly countries, the Tajiks don't have much of a choice but to play nice as well. The Turks have also been trying to squeeze some influence out of the middle corridor, but with them so geographically isolated from the rest of the Turkic states, their gains have been fairly minimal. In fact, the current route being used would allow China to completely cut out Turkey from the corridor altogether if they needed to, shipping goods from Georgia through the Black Sea. Turkey would very much like to change this imbalance of leverage, and they may be seeking to do so with their Turkic ally in Azerbaijan. They would like a second route going directly from Azerbaijan to Turkey, but to do so they would need to go through the Zengezur corridor in Armenia. Needless to say, Armenia's antipathy towards Turkey due to their insistence on taking them on long hikes, let's just say, makes such a prospect incredibly unlikely. There have also been clashes and wars between the Armenians and the Azerites throughout the years. The most recent one in 2022 bordered on genocide of Armenians in the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. So it's pretty clear this route won't materialize through an agreement. However, there has been speculation that the Azerites are preparing to invade and occupy the Zengezur corridor to connect their mainland with the Nakhchivan Autonomous Republic, which is technically a region of their country. If this happens, it could turn into a major regional war. Why? Well, you see, the Russians also want to use the Zengezur corridor for a trade route of their own. The International North-South Transport Corridor connecting Russia with Georgia, Armenia, Iran, and India. This would give them significant influence in India and Iran, which can be used to counterbalance China's growing influence in Central Asia Afghanistan, and Pakistan. China obviously wouldn't like this, but they also don't want to deal with Turkish influence in Central Asia, so they would remain neutral in a conflict over the Zangezur corridor. Why not just have the route go through Azerbaijan, you may ask? Well, the Iranians basically see them as a second Israel right on their borders, given their intense military cooperation with them. Needless to say, Iran sees this as an existential threat to them, and they aren't about to include them in a massive trade agreement like this. Plus, if the Azerites are able to establish direct trade with Turkey, that would threaten Iranian leverage over the Turks with the trade route going through Iran. It would also greatly increase Turkey's power by extending their influence across the Caspian Sea and over Central Asia. This would be disastrous for Iran and pretty bad for the Eastern Empire as a whole. So with the opportunity for Turkey and the risk for Iran, they are both likely to enter the war themselves, Iran first and Turkey in response. Russian troops have acted as peacekeeping forces in the region, so they would also defend Armenia. And given the stakes, Russia could send additional forces or even open a second front on their border with Azerbaijan. This would likely prompt Iran to directly invade as well, given that they claim Azerbaijan as their territory lost long ago. If this all wasn't enough, Georgia might take advantage of this scenario and try to recapture their lost territory from Russia. Georgia is seeking NATO membership, but you can't become a member if you have disputed territory, meaning they must have both Abkhazia and South Ossetia under their control in order to be admitted. And while they are technically independent, Russia is treaty bound to protect them, and thus a war would ensue. Turkey may even nudge the Georgians to go for it with promises of military aid in order to thin out Russian resources. Next thing you know, there is a massive regional war going on with Russia, Turkey, and Iran as the major actors, and Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia as the minor actors. The Caucasian Wars, or the War of the Caucasus, is the hidden possible third major conflict in the early years of the Second Cold War. I won't be going into as much detail as I did with Ukraine or Taiwan, as it is still a question whether it will even happen or not. It could also happen much further down the line, in which case we would be dealing with factors we don't even know about today. But to put a bow on it, let's briefly touch on some possible outcomes. If Russia is still dealing with Ukraine, Georgia is very likely to act, and the Russians will take a more defensive stance, just to hold existing territory. The Russians are very good at attritional warfare, and are much better at defense and counterattacks than offensive operations. This situation would likely result in a white peace, where borders remain where they are now, albeit with a lot of security agreements to make sure this doesn't happen again. This is because the Iranians are unlikely to go for a full-scale invasion of Azerbaijan without the support of the Russians. Dealing with Turkey and holding Armenian territory will be Iran's priority. If the Armenian coalition is particularly successful, Azerbaijan may even be forced to cede Nagorno-Karabakh and its surrounding area to Armenia. If Russia has concluded their war in Ukraine when this conflict begins, the Georgians are very unlikely to act unless they are just that suicidal. However, if they don't invade, Russia, being confident with their success in Ukraine, may stage a provocation regardless to take advantage of the growing conflict. On the other hand, if Georgia does invade Abkhazia and South Ossetia, they will become a part of the Russian Federation. Simple as. Russia will not tolerate such a belligerent and risk a conflict in the future. The Russians will also be more confident about getting further involved in the fight against Azerbaijan. This, along with Turkey having to divide their forces more, Iran will likely march on Baku to seize the country for themselves. With Russia annexing Georgia, they may tolerate an Iranian annexation of Azerbaijan, especially if they are occupying the capital, though the Russians may negotiate a redrawing of the lines in the north of the country to include their ethnic groups in their territory and to even out the border. Armenia will probably remain independent and even get their ethnic territory in Azerbaijan as a concession by the Iranians to the Russians. They will then be a protectorate state and likely puppet state of Russia. I wouldn't be entirely surprised if during the course of the war, the Armenian leadership are hit by an Azeri coalition airstrike or missile, and the Russians need to rush in to set up an emergency government to navigate the war. Oh, and as for the actual Azeri coalition, I don't see them being particularly successful in either scenario, outside of the opening days and weeks while the defending side is adjusting to the conflict. Turkey's military is weaker than the Iranians, say nothing about the Russians, so don't expect them to be the coalition's saving grace. And NATO's Article 5 doesn't apply in a situation where the nation is the aggressor, so the West won't be helping Turkey either. It's not like they've built up much of any goodwill with them, so they'd be lucky to even get weapon shipments. In short, this is just not a good idea for the Turks, but that's never stopped them in the past, so why stop now?
I don't think anybody around the table today wants to descend into a new Cold War with China. I don't think that's where people are, but I think people see challenges. They see things that we have to manage together, but they also see opportunities. And I think that what we need to do is do it together.
I find this whole prospect of a second Cold War to be highly beneficial to humanity. Putting all of your eggs in one basket, even if you really like that basket, is not good for the eggs. If you drop the basket, all of the eggs break, and there will be no more chickens to have eggs in the future. But if you have multiple baskets and drop one, the eggs from the other baskets will survive so that there will be chickens to make eggs in the future, and thus have a reason to have baskets. Now you might say that one particular basket is objectively the best, while the others are flimsy and degraded. However, even if this is true, the example still holds, as you could still drop that one very sturdy basket while the flimsy ones survive. It might not be the best replacement, but it's better than nothing while you rebuild the sturdy basket. Some might initially agree with this sentiment, but then say, oh, but not that basket. It's okay to have different types of civilizations, but not that one. The problem with this thinking is that everyone believes that anything outside of their paradigm is beyond the pale, so the only alternatives they would find acceptable aren't actually that different. You might say it's radical to be okay with the existence of democracies, republics, empires, theocratic monarchies, feudal societies, patriarchies, matriarchies, imperial nations, imperial empires, capitalist, socialist, communist, and fascist countries, military juntas, and many, many more. I clearly have my preferences, and not all of these need to exist. But this variety creates competition on a civilizational level, each striving to show that their own way, or people, is the best. Obviously, there will be more danger in an ever-changing world as opposed to a stagnant one, but stagnancy only has one possible outcome: a slow rot towards an inevitable death, whereas change has many possibilities. You can't win the game if you don't play it. The new Cold War is already upon us. It would be better for America to acknowledge this new reality and shift strategy than to deny what they see and desperately try to cling on to their hegemony. This overextension could destroy the country, which would be disastrous for the world, as you would have no oppositional empire to prevent Eastern domination. Even if you favor the East, given total dominion over the world, they will overreach, as America has, and face the same consequences as the West. So to prevent this mistake from repeating, America must realize their own mistakes and adjust accordingly. What I would suggest is that we should, number 1, seek a peace agreement with Russia, ceding Novorussia to them, allowing Poland, Hungary, and Romania to expand a little, and have the remaining Ukrainian state be neutral and demilitarized by treaty. Number 2, seek an agreement with China to split Taiwan between them and Japan to prevent the war from happening to begin with. They might not be convinced by this Molotov-Ribbentrop style pact, but it's good to at least try to prevent war. Number 3, give more autonomy and power to some of our colonies. America needs actual partners in the Western coalition, not just subjects. The two I think should fulfill this role are Europe and Japan. Build them up and let them deal with issues in their spheres of influence while America focuses on the Western Hemisphere. Which brings me to number 4. Focus on our own backyard. I am not opposed to interventionism, but it should be relegated to our sphere of influence. And no, that does not cover the entire planet. A revised Monroe Doctrine should be our policy. Fight against the communists and cartels in Latin America, get a healthy government in Brazil and other corrupt countries in our hemisphere, and maintain hegemony over the Americas. There is certainly more advice I could give, but these are the 4 core elements America should move towards in order to have good footing for the Second Cold War. While there are a lot more complexities than the broad strokes I've painted with, I think this video gives a good illustration of the dynamics at play in this new and changing global order. The 30-year inter-Cold War period between 1992 and 2022 has come to an end, and it's time to start thinking about the new possibilities and paradigms before us. It may be difficult for us to speculate about things that we don't fully understand, but if we're too afraid to be wrong, we will never be right. So long as we're honest about our mistakes and reflect to improve in the future, we can only add to the discourse, not take away, which is why I would very much like to hear from you about your thoughts on all of this. I'm sure you have something to say given the many topics I went over, so let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks to all of you who made it to the end of this very long video, and have a nice day.